is just a quick whistle-stop tour of basically what we do in terms of monitoring bats at Bat Conservation Trust, in terms of the NBMP, the National Bat Monitoring Project, and also what we do as part of science team work. So my name is Leah Gilmore, as I said, and I have been covering Catherine Bowie as the head of science and monitoring at VCT. So I've had a kind of general overview of all of the monitoring and science that goes on. She's since come back from maternity, so she'll be sort of covering that kind of monitoring aspect and most of the science, but I'm going to carry on with this, with the sort of focus on passive acoustic monitoring. So let me click. So a little bit of background to the National Bat Monitoring Programme. You may be aware of some of the surveys that already take place as part of the NBMP. So we've got the Sunset Survey, which is basically an entry-level survey where you look out for bats and other wildlife in your sort of garden or your area, and that's a really nice one to get started on. A little bit more experience, but not too much is needed for the roost count. We're trying to get people on this sort of volunteer journey so that they sort of go from the Sunset Survey onto these other surveys. So the roost count is a really nice one, because if you have an idea of where there might be some bats roosting, you can go and count them, and that can be a really nice sort of way to get into bat monitoring. So definitely something that we would hope to be able to do on Skye. The Waterway Survey focuses on Dorbenton's bats, and that is a stratified survey. So basically it means that the sites are randomly selected and they're allocated to different areas, and you can choose those sites and walk a transect and look for Dorbenton's bats, which are quite easy to identify in the way that they fly over the water. The Field Survey is also another of the structured surveys that focuses on a few different species, and I think in Scotland it's just nocturals and the two common pipistrelle and soprano pipistrelle. But that's again a sort of random stratified sampling design, so you get those sort of allocated sites, which is important for when I talk about bee bats in a bit. So other surveys include the Hibernation Survey and the Woodland Survey, which focuses on barbastels, and of course the National Enthusiast Pipistrelle Project, which is a little bit more in depth and involves specifically enthusiast pipistrelles. So the surveys that I wanted to talk to you mainly about today are British Bat Survey, or bee bats, and a little bit about Night Watch. So these are our kind of new PAM surveys. The reason I say new is because the Woodland Survey is also a passive acoustic monitoring survey, and there's elements of passive acoustic monitoring in some of the other surveys. Technically, the Field Survey is still a passive acoustic monitoring survey. It just doesn't include static detectors, which these do, the audio, as you will be aware. So what about bee bats? What was the point of bee bats, the aim, the reason that we got the funding, the reason we wanted to do it in the first place? So key with this survey is targeting underrepresentation in bat monitoring. So that's habitats, for example, upland areas and other sort of key habitats that are sort of missing from bat monitoring in general, from what we've seen from the NBMP already. Geographical areas, so specific areas, again, upland areas, but also Wales and Scotland are generally underrepresented compared to England, and also certain species that may not have been able to be sort of monitored so far that could have be targeted with this survey. So bee bats is a stratified random sampling design, so a structured survey similar to the Field Survey, and at the moment we're sort of in the pilot year. So we did a pilot year last year, and we're looking to do a beta year this year, so there'll be 2 beta years. So it's being basically developed at the moment in terms of what that sort of sampling is going to look like. So I think you took part in the pilot study, which is which was unstructured. So there was not that sort of sampling design as such, which is why going forward, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, in terms of sky monitoring, BBATs, we'll see how we get on with BBATs in terms of where the sites are selected on Sky. But in terms of a Sky focused project, it might be better to think of BBATs as that kind of legacy for the future rather than something to use in the meantime, which is why it's great that we've got this Species on the Edge project, really. So again, it's a passive acoustic monitoring project using static detectors, these audio moths, and it uses BCT's sound classification system. So the idea is that BBATs will be integrated into the MBMP business as usual by the end of the sort of project or the funding, so by over 5 years. And so the whole point is that we will be able to plug those gaps that we've got with monitoring. Well, we're going to try anyway, to plug those gaps to be able to sort of monitor bats better right across the UK. So there's also future work sort of planned to integrate some of the results from the field survey and also the Night Watch survey, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. So integrating those results together so that we get a bigger understanding and a better picture of bats populations across the different regions. So I just wanted to highlight a bit about Night Watch, just because we may be able to borrow some bits from Night Watch. Night Watch is predominantly urban focused, so wouldn't be useful as a survey necessarily for some of the regions that are the Species on the Edge focuses on, but it's got really nice sort of way of sort of structure to the survey in terms of its engagement possibilities, and the fact that it's a bit like the Sunset survey but with the addition of the passive acoustic monitoring. So it's all about looking to see what wildlife you might find in your garden. So we could learn some things from Night Watch in terms of what we're going to do in terms of outreach in the future. So yeah, this is just the leaflet that they give out as part of Night Watch, showing you how to put out the detector and things like that. So a little bit about BCT's automated sound classification system. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but I just wanted to explain a bit about how it works, so you have that context of where your data, when we collect your data, where it's going, and interpret the results a little bit when we look at the reports. So it starts off with bats making a sound, and we put out some kind of sensor, in this case the audio moths, which picks up that sound, records that sound in the form of audio files, and that data is then uploaded into a cloud-based system, and in our case it's called Amazon Web Services. So it's a sort of branch of Amazon where they have cloud computing sort of storage, but also ability to sort of do complex computing tasks in the system. So all of our data is uploaded, and then we have an algorithm that classifies that data. So it detects whether there's a bat call there, and then it classifies that based on training that it's done on the different species calls. So we have a training data set, and we're still working to sort of better the system and make it even better to be able to detect the different species. So there's ongoing work there, but it will classify those species, and then it will sort of write results files, which we can then download and process and do some post-processing to be able to produce these results and bespoke feedback reports. So the future, this is still under sort of development, but the future sort of vision is that this system is as fully automated as possible. And obviously at the moment, there's still bits and pieces that need to be done manually by people, but it's hoped that we will get this kind of system as automatic as possible. Now that's important in terms of your bespoke reports that you've got. So just an understanding of this system being automated is really important, because even though they're tailored to the individual sites, you still have that kind of generic element. So it's important to do things like this that we're doing today to be able to sort of drill down into those results and make them applicable to the, you know, the individual people or sites or projects that those reports are coming from. So something to be in the back of the mind. Obviously these were BBATS reports, but you know, there may be scope to produce sort of relevant reports to the projects at later points. So this is just a slide saying how the classification system works, and it's based on a system of artificial neural networks, and the algorithm is actually called the BAT Detect version 2 algorithm, and there's links in my slides which I can share with you if you want to know any more, but I'm not going to go into too much detail now. So a little bit more about the results from Sky. So you had 4 sites that you were looking to monitor, and 2 recorded. So that's the Staffin site and the Dun Vegan site, and 2 that did not. And as we sort of discussed earlier, the Staffin site was successful in getting sort of 4 species, and the Dun Vegan got 1 species, but great that we got something recorded. So that's really exciting. I'm going to get the reports up in a minute just to have a closer look, and we can go through how those results look and sort of drill down into it a little bit. But I thought that might be sort of good to share my screen, but open up to anybody who might want to sort of talk as we go through it. But just as a general overview, I think a really important thing is the number of nights that were recorded. So typically BBATs are sort of aimed at 3 nights, but we've got 5 nights of data there. And I think that's really interesting in terms of, you know, looking at what sort of activity you get over those nights. And that may inform in future how we decide to deploy the audio moths on Sky, and considering things like weather and stuff like that. So I just want to point out that BBATS has this very specific protocol, and data is stored centrally and not made available. So in terms of the future of monitoring on Sky, it's really important that we have some ownership of that data, so that the data is collected and stored on Sky as well, so that people have access if they want to that data, or at the very least Catherine has access, or you know, the people that are interested do, to be able to look at it maybe as part of training. With BBATS, you send your detectors back, it gets uploaded to the cloud, and no one tends to look at it that much more closely, apart from some validation checks, because the idea is this huge sort of overall monitoring project where sort of intensive data collection and looking at specific sites isn't part of that remit. But this kind of Sky monitoring project, which is tailored to the area and has a really important sort of legacy after the Species of the Edge project, we might want to sort of, you know, move away from that kind of BBATS sort of style of things, and make sure that that data is, you know, made more widely available to people if they want to get involved a bit more. So yeah, so just have a quick look through. So I don't know if it foxed everyone else, but it foxed me at first when I looked at one of the other reports, because I thought we'd got all of these, and I was like, oh no, we've got horseshoes, which means that's sort of a bit worrying. But then I realized that these are the species that are detected at this site. So just to say, I didn't design these reports. These are designed by our research scientist, Ella Browning. So they're kind of new to me as well, but I need to know, you know, the ins and the outs of them to be able to design one for the new Species on the Edge project. So interesting to see all of these species that were recorded as part of BBATS in general, and then this site doing particularly well with, you know, all of those 4 target species, I think, are there that we want from Species on the Edge. So this is quite important, this line here that I made sure was put in, just to make you aware that, you know, although some validation does happen on this data, because it's this kind of big project, if you do have new sort of records for the area, it is important that they are validated, because before being used for record centres or, you know, planning or anything like that. So this is kind of a first look at the area or at your site, rather than being something as evidence that's definitely what's going on. I think it should be a sort of springboard for future projects. A little bit about activity. So obviously the main species we've got is the common pipistrelle, Pipistrellus pipistrellus, and there's quite a nice activity sort of pattern going on. So this is hours since sunset. So just after sunset, you get a kind of nice peak in activity, and then you get another peak sort of later on. So it's what we call a bimodal pattern, which you quite often see with pipistrelles. So it's quite nice that you can see that there, and you can see tiny little blue pattern in there, which is the Pipistrellus pygmaeus. Harder to see some of the others in there because obviously they had less calls overall, so that was sort of in comparison to the common pip, which is often the case, it's quite hard to see. You can see here this bit of green, which is Myotis species. They're grouped because they're difficult to tell apart, but that is 9 hours since sunset. So that's quite typical of Myotis species. You might see them a bit later in the night. That's quite nice to be able to see that in that graph there. Per night, this is the bit where I got a bit excited because, and I was trying to explain to Claire earlier, because when Angelina was explaining to me what happened with your different audio moths, Jeanette, and some of them not recording and others, you know, and it says on the form that it's all, you know, that a no bat sort of result is still a result, whereas it's quite difficult to tell sometimes when whether it is a no bat result or whether it's just not recorded. I think in this case it was that they just didn't record, but my other colleague was telling me about, you know, the further you get on, if you're recording for sort of up to 5 nights and the batteries start sort of going, you're quite often going to lose the sort of data from those later nights. But we've got data all across, and interestingly we've got different patterns going on across those nights. I presume this was all the same site, in the same place. So, you know, Catherine raised something really important when I spoke to her recently, which is about weather on Skye. And, you know, whereas 3 nights might be okay for some of the sort of more southerly distribution, you know, of bats in the UK, to be able to capture an idea of what's going on, we might need a few more nights. So this is something that's really interesting on Skye if we are going to get nights where weather is an issue. And I would say we don't know for sure, but it's interesting to see these sort of the first 2 nights we get this like peak early on, and then these nights, you know, that we've got sort of spread across, and it may be that it started raining, or maybe just something to do with that specific bat. But if we'd have only recorded for say 2 nights, we may not have ever found out that there were placotis there, for example, the purple bit that you can see here. So it's a trade-off between, you know, lots of data being collected or you know, wanting to move the detectors around, but really interesting to see that data spread across those 5 nights and how different it is. But then when you combine it all, you do get this kind of general 2 peaks, which we often see with common pipistrelles. So yeah, so just a little bit of interesting to drill down into some of the little bits of this specific site. And let me have a look if I can find the other one which recorded. The other one that recorded, interestingly, was just a sort of one sort of 2-hour block of common pip activity on one night. So you can see nothing else, or maybe a little bit on this one here, and a little, yeah, small amounts there. But interestingly, it's a bit of a different picture, and I would say that sort of site we might want to go back to and see if we can redeploy the detector and see if we can get any more information, because something's gone on there. Makes me think that's not sort of natural pattern, yeah. But still,
yeah, we were worried at the start because that we were a bit late in the season, so I don't know whether for like 2023 what months we should really be targeting.
September, yeah, I can see that. So, yeah, I mean, it's all going to be learning, Jeanette, because we don't know. I mean, Claudia will have a bit more of an idea of Scotland in general, and Catherine was saying to me, for example, there's no point starting until, was it May or June? with certain things. Yeah. So, but I would say we just don't know. So we've got to decide a cutoff point of when we want to sort of stop. But at the same time, it depends on the weather, and it depends on whether, you know, we think bats are still active and still doing things. And I have to say, from everything else that I've learned, you know, these rules about 10 degrees or whatever it is, you know, I've bats always do different things to what you expect. So I think the rule book goes out the window a little bit with Sky, and we feel our way a bit at first. But I think September, you could easily still be getting good activity. But this one, I'm not sure. We'd need to sort of go back and revisit that site to understand what's really going on there. But yeah, I'm going to stop sharing now, because that's kind of it from me. But any questions at all or discussion?
Well, I'd just like to ask Hannah some questions about the site, and if you, I know it's a long time ago now, but can you remember what the weather was like over those 5 days? And it would be really nice to have a bit of an understanding of what your dad's croft's like. Does he have a water body there? Is there a wee loch or pond or something going on?
Where he put the audio moth was actually just near the house. We've got quite a lot of trees around the house, and I think we actually had quite good weather when it was out. I don't think there was much wind really from what I remember, and I think it was a fairly dry spell, unusually. So, but yeah, it was just maybe, well, it was just at the bottom of the garden, really, kind of onto the side of the croft. But yeah, there's a lot of shelter where it was. So, and we've always had loads of bats in the garden from when I was little, in the evening.
It's really exciting that you found all 4 of them there in the first go. So hopefully your dad will be keen to have us back, and we'll do some more monitoring there.
I'm sure he
So-
will.
Because the habitats would be, there'd be sort of like sort of not intensive silage fields and the trees, and then you're quite near the Kerrang, you know,
Yeah.
famous sky, so you're near a bit of heathland and stuff as well, so there's probably quite a nice lot of edge effects going on maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, there's moor just on the other side of the road as well. So, and it's fairly quiet around with us in the evening. We don't really, there's not much traffic or anything. We're the only house really for quite a bit. So,
And do we know if sorry, maybe this is a really stupid question for me, but what, I know we're always saying that Sky's bat deficient, but what kind of records do we have for Sky at the moment?
I don't think we're bat deficient. I think we're just recording deficient.
Deficient. Yeah, but what records do we have at the moment? Do we know much
So,
at all? Or?
So there's, if you look at the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, there are quite a few records of pipistrelle, but there are only 2 records of delbentins, which are the myotis species, and 4 brown long-eared bats, which we picked up on Hannah's as well. So they're really quite exciting records. And I have heard reports of bats being around, but it's having them actually recorded and fed into these networks. So, I mean, there's hardly any records for anything other than pipistrelles. So any records we get are fantastic, basically.
I've got a little map that I can share as well.
Yeah, I think we're starting from scratch really, which is why it's really important that we sort of work together to get the methodology sort of honed, so that it is something that people want to carry on doing, or that is, you know, there's a legacy from the project, so that it's not, if we don't just come in and do our project and come out again and leave some records behind, it's that people continue to do it. And I think that's why I was sort of saying about moving away from BBATs a little bit, because although BBATs will be brilliant, and people, you know, if there are sites to be selected up there, you know, we'll see for the future, and that's brilliant if people want to contribute to that. But it's nice to have that kind of ownership on the data and be able to go down into it a little bit. So, you know, we've got that report there, but it would be nice to go and have an actual look at the calls and see, you know, what's it identifying at, you know, the classification as meiotis, or what's it saying about placotis, and have a look and what time of night that happened, and were there any social calls, and, you know, those sorts of things. It's a bit, you know, if the landowner or if, you know, interested parties want to get involved more, they can, rather than this kind of BBATS, which is harder. So that's more, I think BBATS is more of a legacy for the future, but we'll sort of try and develop a bit more of a sky focused monitoring scheme, which I think Claire was going to say a bit more about anyway later.
Just a really quick overview. These are the species that we know occur in the UK, all around the UK. So there's 18 species, 17 of which we know are breeding within the UK. Of course, Scotland being further north has a lower number of species. So I've just circled in red the ones that we know we have. It's 8 species. So the Benton's bed, whiskered, Naturalists, noctule liceless, and then common and soprano pipistrelle, Narcissus pipistrelle and brown long-eared. And we do think that we probably have brunsbets as well, but we don't have any evidence. So you already see Scotland-wide, we don't even know how many species we have. And then if we focus in on Skye, we have records, as Catherine said earlier, of Benton's bed, common pipistrelle, soprano pipistrelle, and brown long-eared. But we also know that there is a likelihood of Naturalists bed and Narcissus pipistrelle, so 2 species that may or may not occur on Skye. And I've got a little screenshot. Catherine mentioned the NBN atlas. I just got this data, extracted this data. This is not the only data out there, so unfortunately sometimes data can be scattered, but this is generally where all the data should end up. And the dots on the map, you can see the red ones are Pipistrellus pipistrellus, which is the common pipistrelle, and we've seen also the BBATS record showed very similarly. This one seems to be kind of widespread on Skye and occurs regularly. And then we know a little bit less about the other species. I mentioned Natura's bed. We don't actually have a record on Skye, but very close by. So that indicates that there is a good likelihood that it also occurs on Skye, and we just have not recorded it yet. Narcissus pipistrelle, we don't even have a dot on the map. We know so little about the species that we don't know really how much of them we get in Scotland at all. So it's another species that is really, really interesting to learn about. And if we get a record on Skye, that would be fantastic. That would really be triggering a lot of kind of scientific research needs. That and yeah, at the moment we've got Scotland-wide a project that we're actually looking for the species because we know so little about it. On our website, you can read a little bit more about the individual species. I'm not going to go into any detail here. But the main thing that has been mentioned over and over again, we know a little bit about bats, but we don't know an awful lot. The knowledge gaps are massive, especially in Scotland, because of, well, we've got some areas that have high population density, and a lot of the universities are denser there as well. The skills in terms of bat research are focused on that area, but areas like Skye are just under-recorded. So it's really, really good to have a project that focuses on that area and addresses these knowledge gaps. So as I said, we don't even know what species we've got in Scotland, even less so what species occur on Skye. Where these different species occur, we've got kind of rough distribution areas. Some species are more in the southeast, some more in the southwest. So any record that we get is really valuable actually, because it gives us more information about the areas, the geographical areas that the species use, including on Skye. We also don't really know where bats roost, and I think this is where landowners really come into play, and it's an important thing that should also be considered. So we've got tree roosting species. Actually, all of our species roost in trees. Some also roost in buildings and other structures like castles and bridges. And then we've got underground sites, especially in winter for the hibernation, caves and mines. So we could look into all of these things with a focus species for the Species on the Edge project as well. And working with landowners is really important for that. There's kind of things like, where do pipistrelles roost in winter? Big scientific questions that are totally unanswered. Maybe not a focus on Skye, but it's generally quite amazing what we don't know. Also bat migration. I mentioned Nathusius pipistrelle as a species we know very little about. What we do now know is that it can migrate thousands of kilometers. So the likelihood that it crosses Skye, maybe on its way elsewhere, is there. There's a possibility. And that's, of course, really important in a wider geographical context for all of Europe. We have massive knowledge gaps in activity patterns. So what time of night are bats active and which species, especially in Scotland, especially in areas where the day and night hours are different to other areas of the UK. So Skye is really, really interesting from that perspective. We've got shorter days or longer days than the rest of the UK at different times. Then mating behavior is a big unknown, breeding behavior, feeding, basically the whole ecology of a lot of the species. And the little bit of data that we've just looked at showing at what time of night, for example, bats are active, can already give us a little bit more information about each of these behaviors. So you can extract a lot of information just from a few nights of recording. Why is that important? Of course, Species on the Edge has a huge opportunity working with landowners, having their pieces, their little areas that they know like inside out, and they can deploy the detectors at the right places. I think it's really, really important to use that local knowledge and work with people to target the kind of batty areas a little bit more. And the data is not only there so that we have a map with lots of dots on it, but we can then also use it both in kind of locally on Skye, but also for Scotland, the UK, and even Europe, depending on the species found, to inform planning, for example, wind farm developments. It's really, really important to know where your bets are for that. Legislation and policy. We can only protect species in areas where we know they are. There will never be legislation in place if we don't know that a bat is there. So we can't protect anything we don't know anything about. And then guidance and recommendations. For example, how is it, do you protect bat habitat? How is it, are the farming methods best for bats? Because bats, of course, eat lots of midges. And I think especially on Skye, we need a lot of bats to tackle that. Hopefully that will enthuse people to protect their bats. But yeah, that's just a really, really brief overview to basically say, we know a little bit and we don't know an awful lot. And this project will be good to tackle that.
So I'm the project officer based on Skye. There are 11.8 project officers across Scotland. I'm the only one hosted by the Bat Conservation Trust. So my focus will primarily be bats, and it will primarily be Skye, but I'll also be working with all the other project officers across several other project areas as well. So there'll be opportunities for not just bat conservation on Skye, but also some other species as well. But a big part of my job will be engaging with the public, particularly landowners. We want to understand opportunities and barriers to conservation, and we'd really love to know well, to get all the information that crofters have about their land. They know the land better than anyone else, but also how we can help them. So I anticipate that subsidies and things like that are going to head more towards conservation and carbon capture and things like that. So we want to be able to work with crofters to come up with a practical land management guide that we can share across the area, basically. I think is the main kind of focus that we want to achieve with landowners on Skye. So I'd be really interested to know what crofters want out of this project, if anything, or if they have much enthusiasm to get involved, basically. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much all I really need to say about the project for now, other than we're at the very early days, and we're still working on things like how we're going to go about monitoring bats on Skye. Like Leah alluded to earlier, we're going to sort of probably use a lot of the framework that we've already got, but we're going to make it a bit more bespoke so that we can focus on areas that we're interested in focusing on, rather than being restricted by predetermined grid squares. So yeah, we're still at the very early days, but we want to open communications early so that we can get feed, so that the crofters can feed into what we're doing and make it like co-create this together so that it benefits everybody, basically.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, I suppose just to second that, really. So we've got a really good opportunity now. We can be really flexible actually in our approach with Species on the Edge and how we go about things. And as Catherine was just saying, that we've got some tools and we've got some survey techniques and things already in place that we can potentially use and adapt. But it would be really good to get opinions really from crofters to see what you're really wanting from it. I've got a couple of questions that I specifically wanted to ask, and of course Jeanette and Hannah, I'm really keen to hear your thoughts, but I was wondering if I can just ask the questions here, and maybe whether Jeanette, you'd be able to, when you share the recording, maybe you can share my email address and Catherine's email address. So if anybody has any specific kind of thoughts or opinions, that they can get back in touch with us easily.
Yeah, happy to. And the other thing is obviously, so we'll share with the 4 that were involved in the audio moths, but we've also got meetings coming up in June as FAS Connect that Catherine's been to one already. So that might be something that, you know, to get like a wider group of people, that might be a way of keeping in touch with that kind of, you know, as an introduction. So it's not having to just have a meeting about bats. It might be one of our meetings that people are coming to, and you can have a wee segment kind of thing just to.
Yeah, that would be really nice. Thank you very much for that. So I suppose the questions that we're really wanting to begin with, I suppose, go back to basics really, and thinking about what would a good output be for crofters. What would you really want to know? As we've just shown, as Claudia has just mentioned, there's so many knowledge gaps for us, so all the monitoring is useful for us, but we would like to know what would be really useful for crofters, and that I mean this in terms of your own land and maybe Skye more generally. And I'm gonna that's a really big question, so I'm going to give a couple of examples of potential things. For example, understanding how your croft relates maybe to the rest of Skye, or maybe to the rest of, say, the west coast of Scotland, or how your croft relates to other crofts across Scotland. Or it might be something like an interest in understanding key areas of your croft, so maybe something kind of really hyper local, really understanding where bats are foraging in your land. Another example might be understanding bats' response to particular management strategies. Might be something that you're particularly interested in. So say if you're showing this, there's absolutely no such thing as a silly response to that at all. It is literally just there's no wrong answer to that. It's really what you think would be useful and what you would, in an ideal world, want to see. So my caveat here is that we will take all of those ideas and opinions really seriously, and we'll look at them and see what we can incorporate into a survey design. I will say we do have limitations in terms of time, cost and things like that, but we will really try and implement that. I don't know if Jeanette or Hannah, you had anything sprang to mind I don't want to put you on the spot though.
No, that's okay. I think definitely we'll share it around the group and get wider responses, because but one thing that I think is probably useful is to keep an eye of subsidy changes that are coming. Like in Scotland, they've got preparing for sustainable farming, and there's due to be habitat mapping for that. So if species from the edge could coincide, help with, you know, maybe producing some habitat maps that then crofters or agents could use as a basis for that, and that because bats don't really figure much in agri-environment schemes at the moment, so that's maybe a weakness. The other thing that maybe to think about in Skye is that there's the Skye Crofting and Corncrake partnership, and I don't know if RSPB has been in touch, but we had a meeting with them and we were talking about how, you know, the recording on the audio moths, and they've done some work of recording corncrakes and recognizing them and working out where they're moving between different townships. So I don't know if there's some tech like sharing and maybe seeing, you know, if some of the areas that are good for corncrakes, if they're, you know, since insects are the driver, if there's some overlap between bats and corncrakes might be useful.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And RSPB are actually a partner in Species on the Edge. Yeah, really, really good points. Thank you so much for that.
Can I ask,
Oh yeah.
Audio monitoring of corncrakes? So using detectors?
No, I think they're using phone when because they're doing night surveys of corncrakes, and Hannah's going to keep me right. We just had a talk about this last week. So what they do is they record them on their mobile phones when they take off some, like, they try and have the settings that mean that it's quite a good recording. But it seems a very manual process they're using. They're uploading, and then, you know, and they can tell, like, it's like a wee bit of a fingerprint kind of thing. But I don't know if there's a way that, because I was wondering if you could use like audio moths being deployed more in the corncrake areas rather than people having to be standing in a field near a corncrake with a mobile phone kind of thing. So yeah, again, this is way out of my area of expertise, but I just thought, oh, I wonder if there would be some like cross sharing as part of that could happen.
There could be. I've done passive acoustic monitoring for birds before, so yeah, that's a good idea to try and do two things at once.
Or at least into their project, even if, you know, if there's some way of detecting them, we'd have to see what was possible. But yeah, exciting.
I believe they do acoustic monitoring as part of Species on the Edge in the Solway on Natterjack toads. So there might be a link of how to combine things as well.
That's what I love about this program of work, that there's just so much going on. And there's another couple of questions just to ponder, and that is how involved everyone would like to be. And that's quite, again, there is an appetite really for people wanting to put the static detectors out themselves, or whether it's actually just easier for somebody on the project team or a volunteer to go out and do that for people, put it on their land, to learn more about bat surveys and bat survey techniques, go out with a bat detector, actually maybe see some bats in the evening. So it's just, I suppose, wanting to understand if there is that interest in doing that. And the other question is around how the information is presented and what you need. And I think, Jeanette, you raised a really good point about that mapping idea. But it's just really wanting to understand from the people that have actually took part in BBATs last year, actually, what was the experience like? If you were, what would you actually want to see on the report? That type of thing. What would you like from it? And then if we get some feedback on that, then I think we can start to kind of create something that's a lot more tailored, and hopefully really useful for you, as well as for us and for bat conservation.
And so I think that just leads us on to the last agenda item, and it was really to kind of links into what you were saying about maybe this might be one of the potential outputs of is whether, you know, tourism opportunities for bats. So I talked about this one with one of your previous colleagues when Species on the Edge didn't even have funding, didn't really exist yet, kind of thing, and whether, you know, like you were saying, for things like bat walks and things like that, if that could help, because a lot of the people that have taken part have either self-catering or do farmland walks or things like that. So if there's a way that maybe it could be, the bats could be a feature, but that might be something that could be quite interesting. And then that might be another way of getting another source of data coming in, because maybe people on their holidays would like to be out doing things too.
I think they definitely, I can really see that with a different project that I'm working on, which is the Bats in Churches project. We've definitely found that there are people that will come to see the bats. And I know that one example that comes to mind is champing, which is this, it's basically people that camp in a church. It is a thing. But they will, but one of the things that they are, so there's a lot of bats that roost in churches. This is the background to that, but they do give the detectors to people that are champing overnight, and it's an activity that they do. And that seems to go really well. So I think that would be a really lovely thing to do. And I could foresee a couple of things. Well, so the project is 4 years. And I could foresee, so for example, working with Catherine to maybe have a go, trial that, see if it works, and I'm sure it will. Everybody loves a bat walk, so it's such an engaging experience. But there might be something that we can do around training. I know Claudia gives really good training on how to deliver bat walks and good tips. So it might be something that in the future, because obviously the project is only here for 4 years, so it'd be really good to give crofters the tools and the knowledge to be able to do that themselves and include that in their offer. So it might be something that we can, training to feel comfortable to do that might be something that we can offer, if that would be of use.
Yeah, well, I think that would be interesting. Like all these things, I think there'll be a spectrum, like a lot of your answers, I can imagine there'll be a spectrum, but I think it's important to have a toolkit that means that you can meet people at the various points that they are, kind of thing. So that's all sounds very exciting.
Definitely. And I can definitely see that where and I'm sure we will find some roosting sites on Skye. That can be really exciting, actually, doing roost counts and watching the bats coming out of their roost, going foraging in the evening. And that's I think that's always a real spectacle and something that's lovely to see. And I'm sure if we find some roosts on people's crofts, that's that I can imagine that being a lovely thing to take people to. And yeah, would you agree, Claudia, that sometimes that roost counts can be really engaging, can't they?
Yeah, I've done a lot of bat walks over the years, and I've done them on little music festivals, and people come with their families, with children, and always all ages are really, really interested and enthused. So yeah, I'm pretty sure there would be opportunities to link that up somehow.
Yeah, one of the things I definitely want to do as part of the project is get out to all the little villages, or as many as possible, and hold at least one bat walk, or possibly a workshop as well, depending on interest. And we'll have a few detectors and pieces of equipment as well, that if people are really keen, you know, we can loan them out. And yeah, any monitoring done by anyone anywhere is going to be fantastic for us. And I just wanted to say as well, Jeanette, for your Crofters for information, bats are their ecosystem indicators. So if you have bats on your land, it means you've got a really healthy ecosystem. So they're a really positive species to have around. It shows that your soil's healthy and everything else going on is healthy. So they're definitely worth looking after. And yeah, part of my job is going to be out engaging with everybody everywhere as much as possible in the first instance, and just so that they have a bit of an awareness, and then anyone who's interested further, we'll keep them with us on our journey going forward.
No, I think that positive message is important, because I think it seems surprising, but I think there's a lot of like negativity against sort of maybe farming, and maybe people think that they're kicking industrial farming when in the press, but the crofters kind of take that on board as well, kind of thing. So I think you're definitely, if you can lead with positive messages, that's definitely more engaging than just always like, because I think a lot of the time they feel that people are always telling them what they're doing wrong, whereas actually the fact that these are good indicator umbrella species, I think sometimes everyone assumes that people know that, but they don't, if you see what I mean, or that message gets a wee bit lost. So I think that's a really good foot to start on. Great. So does anybody have any, I really appreciate all the time that everyone's given. I've learned loads today, and we'll circulate it, and we'll help with Species on the Edge however we can. Has anybody got any final questions or discussion points?
No, but just to say thank you very much for all the work that you've given for Bat Conservation Trust, but for the development of Species on the Edge. Yeah, really appreciated, and it will be really good working with you kind of moving forwards as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much for coming, and I'm so glad that I didn't get drowned out by my small terrier in the background too much. So I really appreciate all your patience and time. So thank you very much.